Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be giving you my review of the upcoming game based upon the Warhammer Age of Sigmar universe, and that is The Rise and Fall of Anvalor by Wizkids. Now this game was announced at Essen in 2018 and is due for release in April of 2019. I've been very fortunate enough to get my hand on a review copy of it, so I'm going to give you my thoughts, tell you a little bit about how the game plays, and let you know whether it's something I think you should pick up. Now, The Rise and Fall of Anvalor is a game for 1 to 4 players, and it plays in about an hour. Let me read you some of the flavour text from the background, as I think that's quite important. If you're an Age of Sigmar player, you'll certainly want to know how it fits with the Warhammer universe. So Anvalor is a very strategic place within the Realm of Fire and is of great importance. There's been many attempts to try and build fortifications here, but all have been met with failure. Now, Anvalor is slap bang in the middle of Anvilgard, Hammerhall, and the city of Brimstone. And those factions from around those different areas have all put their differences aside to try and come together to build this fortification to try and keep out the enemy. However, they're all trying to secretly build this fortification for themselves, which will gain them control over the wider area. Now, this is quite thematic because the game sees you playing as a cooperative game where you're all trying to battle against a common enemy. However, at the end of the game, one of you will win. It's not a case of you all win or you all lose. You'll all defeat the enemy, but only one of you will be the winner. So it's that very interesting mix of cooperative game, but with a bit of a competitive twist, which I quite like. Now, as I said, this is for 1 to 4 players, and very nicely, they give you a choice of 6 different factions to choose from. Now, those 6 different factions are the Fire Slayers, there is the Hammers of Sigmar, there's the Free Guild, there's Order Serpentis, there's the Dispossessed, and there's also the Anvils of the Heldenhammer as well. Now, the game comes with 3 different enemy factions to battle against. You choose one to battle in your particular game. In this box, there is a Khorne Chaos faction, there's a Skaven faction, and also Oryx. Now, quite interestingly about this game is if you play 1 or 2 players, you use one side of the board, and if you're playing 3 or 4 players, you flip the board over to the other side, which I thought is quite neat. Essentially what it does is it gives you more squares to place your tiles on when you're playing with 3 or 4 players. When you pick your enemy to fight against, you take the tiles for that particular faction. You then take your enemy's overview tile, which has some instructions on how they play. And then there is 4 different Warcry tiles, which all have different numbers on the back. Basically 1 being the easier and 4 being the more difficult to play against. So there's some difficulty levels to be able to be introduced during the game as well, which helps with multiple playthroughs with only 3 different enemies. Similarly, when picking the faction you want to play as, you pick the tiles for that particular faction, and then you also get to choose from 1 of 4 faction aspect cards. These basically give a little bit of flavour to the army, and basically means that when you're playing over multiple times, you can pick and choose to make them act very slightly differently. You can also pick ones that might be more suitable against the enemy you're facing. Within your faction deck, you'll find you have a number of building tiles and a number of unit tiles. Unit tiles are your soldiers. These are the people that will be doing battle with your enemies. And the building tiles essentially give your army some buffs. You also have city tiles, which will go onto your new city building board. These can be purchased using the cards in your deck and will give you bonuses again on the board. The biggest difference here is that when you buy a city tiles and it enters the board, everybody that is playing gets that bonus. But if you put any of the buildings from your own particular tiles onto the board, only your faction gets that bonus. So a sample turn of how the game will go. You start by drawing 5 tiles for your particular faction. In the top left hand corner of the tile, you will see there is a cost. This is what it costs to be able to play that tile into the play area. You'll see in the right hand corner, there is a cost, and this is what that card is worth should you decide to spend it to buy another card. So as an example, this gold mine card is worth 1 manpower if I choose to spend it. I can use that 1 manpower to purchase the Iron Drake card. So this would go into your discard pile, which is face up, and you can then place this on any of the blank tiles on your side of the board. Now, some of these tiles are marked with 2p for 2 player, and some are marked with 1p for 1 player. If you're playing a single player game, you ignore all of the red 2-player tiles. And if you're playing a 2-player game, you ignore all of the yellow 1-player tiles. These then become the equivalent of blank tiles and you can place your units on them. Now around the outside the board we have tiles which are labelled 1, 2, 3 and 4. And these are the areas where your enemy will approach from. The enemy will come from the side of the board towards the centre, attacking anything in its way, be that a building, a city or one of your units, and you have to try and defend the city. You'll eventually get wave after wave of enemies, and when there are no more enemies left, then you are declared the winner. At the start of the game, you take the top 3 tiles from the cities pile. You'll notice at the bottom there is a cost for gold. So in this instance we have 2, 3 and 4. You then place them onto the new city building board in the order of which is the most expensive gold. So where we have 6 here, we would put the highest number. Where we have 4, we'd put the one in the middle. And where we have 2, we'd put this one at the bottom. So what we then can do is, whenever we decide to purchase a city, this is how much it will cost, which is the gold number at the bottom. In the middle is the bonus that that city will grant you. And at the top here is the amount of renown you will get for building that city. Renown is how you score at the end of the game compared to the people you're playing with. Whoever has the most renown, should you defeat the enemy, is the overall winner. So renown is quite important. So we have our 5 cards. We can then, in this instance, use gold mine to spend the manpower to purchase our iron drakes. Gold mine will go to the discard pile. I'll put the iron drakes here to try and protect from side 3 coming in. And then you draw 2 cards. You only ever draw back to a hand of 5. And so if you'd spent more tiles as an example, you would only still draw 2 cards. If you'd only spent 1 tile, you'd only draw 1 to bring you back to your hand size of 5. Once you've drawn your cards, we then go to the enemy's prepare phase. One is if all of the cities are still on the board, player just moves to the next player. If, however, one of the cities have been bought and there's a blank on this board, the enemies then start to build their attack. What you do is you roll a d6 and you look at the result on this dice against the enemy card here. If it's a 1 to a 4, you basically take one of the enemy tiles and place it face down on that number. So if you rolled a 3, for example, you would place it on one of the 3 tiles. So we pop it here, for example. If you'd rolled a 5, you then consult the card and it will tell you what to do. In this instance, you would add 2 of these cards to whichever side had the fewest amount. If there's a tie, you go with the lowest number. So in this case, it would be 1. If you roll a 6, this is where the little individual difficulty upgrade cards come in. So for this particular one, this is the 1 difficulty card. If you roll a 6, you would place 1 of the enemy cards on any particular side. Then a player would move on to the next player. They would have their 5 tiles, which would be out. And they would play exactly the same way. So in this instance, I will spend 2 gold to purchase a city and we'll pop that city in the middle. This would give +1 manpower to placing a unit which has the monster symbol on it. Remember, these city tiles benefit all players in the game, whereas the individual building tiles only benefit that particular faction. Play will continue like this with taking tiles, looking for the enemies to assemble, until eventually an enemy has 3 tiles on one side of the board. At this point in time, you then flip the tiles over in the order. There's an arrow on the board here, and you would activate them in that particular order. And then these enemies would advance across the board, turn by turn. If they come to a city, they just destroy it. And if they come to an opponent, the opponent can attack them. In this instance, the Iron Breaker has a ranged attack and rolls a d4 in attack. He must roll that d4 and try and better the power of the enemy. Now this enemy has a power of 5, so you might be thinking, how can I beat 5 on a d4? Well, of course, in the game, there are buffs that you can have. So as an example, if I had one of my Longbeards here, this Longbeard would give +1 because he is adjacent to the enemy, and this would mean possible that if I rolled a 4, I could have 5 power. Also, if you roll your dice and you get the highest number available on that particular dice, so for example a 4 on a d4, it then explodes and you can roll it again, and this gives you the ability to overpower some of the more difficult creatures. If, however, you roll a 1, this is an automatic fail. If you fail to either equal or better that, you would normally instantly die in the attack. However, because the Ironbreaker has a ranged attack, this means he wouldn't be defeated if he missed in combat. Let's assume the Ironbreaker didn't defeat the Orc. Then what would happen is the units would advance again across the board. This can't advance any further because you're blocking the way, so it would attack you. You have to defend, and you can defend in exactly the same way. However, the only difference being you don't get any support from any friendly characters on the board. And when I say friendly characters, I mean anyone from your faction or any of your fellow players' factions. And also for ranged attacks, you would still die if you failed. If you die, your character basically comes away from the board, goes into your discard pile, and the enemy will march on. If, however, you defeat your enemy, the enemy is removed and goes to a discard pile, and you will score the amount of renown equal to the power of your enemy. There are 2 ways to end the attack from your enemy. Either all of the enemies have been removed because you defeated them in combat, or they make it across and enter a square which has a different number on to which they started on, and they are then also removed from play. Once an attack ends, you then remove any remaining cities from the city board and then draw 3 more cities and replace them again in the order of gold, with the highest at the 6 level and the lowest on the 2 level. If your draw pile ever gets to 0 and you need to draw cards, you just flip over your discard pile and start dealing from the top again. The game continues like this, with you playing tiles, trying to add buffs and add bonuses to your warbands, the enemies building and coming in waves, until eventually you have run down completely the enemy tiles. Once you've run down all of the enemy tiles, this triggers the final assault. The final assault works in a very similar way, and should you defeat that final assault, you are declared the winner. At that point, you count up all of the renown that you've got, and whoever has the most renown is the ultimate winner and takes over control of the city of Anvalor. Now, I've played this game a few times now, both in solo mode and in 2-player mode. I've not yet managed to get a 4-player game in. However, I've saw some big differences between solo and 2-player. The biggest difference being when you play in solo mode, instead of the point where you check to see if there are any blanks on the city tile, if there are, you then roll the dice to place the enemy tiles. In solo mode, you roll the dice every time. I found that this meant that I was getting a lot of enemies onto the board before I actually had an opportunity to build up enough buffs and defenses to get out some of my more powerful warriors, if you like. In 2-player mode, we purposefully didn't buy any of the cities in the early part of the game. This meant we never brought any enemy tiles on, and it allowed us to build up some defenses with our buildings and our units to really start to fight back the horde as they came later. Another way you can trigger bringing onto the enemy tiles, if like us you didn't buy any cities, is when there are no tiles available for you to place any more of your units or buildings. This then triggers an onslaught, which essentially means you just keep rolling to bring on the enemies until it triggers an attack. By the time we did this, we had enough buffs and enough units on the board, we could fend off the enemy as they approached. So I found the single player game was actually quite difficult, as you just got a lot of enemies coming on quite quickly. The 2-player game was much more interesting because we discussed where we were going to place things, we were looking at how buffs would help us, we were looking to see where we'd put the most powerful warriors. In the single player game, I just never felt like I had enough time to acquire buffs to enable me to get out better warriors. By the time I was putting buffs onto the board, the enemies were coming out and they were destroying them. So from an actual game itself, I really did enjoy the 2-player version. My wife played with me, and actually as somebody who doesn't really play a wide range of different board games, and somebody who has no interest in Age of Sigmar at all, she really enjoyed it too. Once she got her head around the rules, and she also understood what the aim of the game was and how she could influence it by the different buffs on the board, she really enjoyed it. We really did kind of get in and talk in tactics. The games that we played in about an hour, so the hour on the box is about accurate. As for the components, I'm really impressed with them. As I was punching all of these cards out, and there is a lot, as I was punching them out from the tiles that they come in, I did think it was kind of overkill. I thought that why have they gone to such trouble to have such thick card? Why wasn't it just more of a card game? It wasn't until I actually played it that I realised why they are so thick, and it just makes it so much easier to be able to pick them up from the board, and that is actually really helpful. It's the kind of things you don't really realise until it's a problem. I also really like the fact that all the different factions, the 6 playable ones and the 3 enemy factions, all have different shaped cards. It means that when you put them back in the box, it's very obvious to identify which cards go with which faction. So should you get them mixed up, it's very quick to sort out. I also like the fact that they've given quite bold colours to all of the different factions, so it's very obvious, again, which one are from which one. The backs of the cards show the AOS faction symbols, and this just brings a little bit of flavour to it. I also really like, yeah, there's a lot I like about this. I really like the fact that there's an organiser tray in there, and everything is laid out in the tray. It means that setup time is next to 0, breakdown time literally takes minutes, and it all just works really well. I also like on the back of the aspect cards for the factions, there's a little bit of flavour text that tells you about that particular faction. So for anyone not into AOS or doesn't really understand a lot about it, it just gives you a bit of background about what your faction is all about. Another nice touch is with these enemy cards, and you have the different powered abilities. They just slot into the bottom as well, which fit really nice. It just stops them getting knocked around. Didn't have to be done, but again, it's just a bit of an eye to quality and a little eye to detail. When I played this on my first run through and I played solo, I honestly thought that this was just a game engine, it was a game mechanic, and that Age of Sigmar had just kind of been shoehorned into it. But the more I played it, the more I saw the Age of Sigmar theme coming through. So for example, in the Skaven deck, there's a Doom Wheel, which starts off as quite low power, but as it advances, you roll a d6. And the number that is basically, it becomes to generate momentum. It rolls that many squares across the board when it advances, and it causes that much damage. That becomes its power. And I like the way they've built some of the kind of theme of that Doom Wheel, sort of building up momentum and rolling through those cities. It just feels quite nice. So the more I played and the more factions I tried, the more I started to see the Age of Sigmar theme coming through. The Khorne faction seemed really powerful. The Skaven faction had bits of buffs and sort of quirky mechanics. The Orc faction seemed to be much stronger when it came to ranged combat because of their armour. There's just a lot of nice little tweaks that were in there, little themes and little mechanics that really did start to feel like the Age of Sigmar theme was coming through. So overall, would I recommend this game? What I would say is if you're buying this game purely to play single player, I think there's probably better single player games out there. I didn't necessarily like the way that there was a bit of a slight tweak to it, and the game felt very different. It was still relatively enjoyable, but I just felt like it wasn't as good as when I played it as multiplayer. The multiplayer game played really well, and we really enjoyed it, the games we had. If you're going to pick up this game and play with 2 to 4 players, then in that case, I would recommend it. I like the fact that there is another side to the board if you're playing with 3 or 4, which gives you more squares to play on. I like the fact that there's 6 factions to choose from, even though you can only play 4. And there's 3 enemies to choose from, even though you only play 1. This gives a lot of replayability. Then build into the fact that you have different difficulty levels for each enemy, and you have different flavour bonuses, the aspects for each of the different playable factions. It just gives a little bit of a different feel each time you play it. The rulebook is laid out quite nicely. However, there is no index and there's no reference at the back of the book. However, the rules are pretty straightforward to learn. There are some different variants. So there is a variant for solo player. There's a beginner's game where you take out the aspect, don't play with aspects, and don't play with the difficulty levels on the enemy. This is a good way, I think, to try and introduce you to the game without too many confusing mechanics. There's multiple faction aspects. So if you want to make your warband a little more powerful, or maybe you have someone that is maybe new to the game and is playing with more experienced players, you can have multiple aspects to your warband. So this is a nice little addition and a sort of difficulty tweak. You can have allied enemies, so you can mix a couple of the enemy decks together. There's some history about Anvalor at the start, which gives you a little bit of flavour about what it's about. There's some history at the back about your enemies and about the Realm of Fire. So if you've never played AOS before, this is quite a nice way to sort of build you into the background and give you a bit of a feel for it. Within the solo game as well, there is a solo sheet here where you can mark down what aspect you used, what difficulty you fought your enemy against, and you can mark the score of how many influence you had at the end of the game so that you can go back and play it again and try and beat your previous scores, which I think is a nice addition. It didn't have to be included, but they have. Overall, my opinion from my first game through to about my 5th game was very different. I played it solo. I was still learning the rules, and as I mentioned before, I'm not as keen on the solo player. So if you're going to get this for solo, maybe give it a try first. However, once I played it multiplayer, it came to life and I really did enjoy the game. The quality of the components is fantastic. Wizkids have done a really good job of taking the AOS theme and porting it across to what many will see is a generic kind of tile mechanic game. If you're an AOS fan, you'll appreciate some of the effort that's gone into theming the game and little nods like the Doom Wheel just rolling across and demolishing cities. So folks, let me know what you think. Is this a game that you'd think about picking up? Are you an AOS fan who maybe doesn't play board games but would consider giving this a go? Or does the fact that it's AOS completely turn you off and it'll be something that you miss? I'd love to know what you think down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.